Today's lesson is going to be on paint, and I'm going to talk to you about the different kinds of paint, and I'm going to talk to you about, the basics of acrylic paint. Acrylic paints are plastic, and it's just like your wall paint that you would buy to put on your wall in some ways. The chemical makeup is these tiny little particles, if you will, of polymer, which is the plastic beads. They're tiny, tiny little plastic beads that are all throughout your paint. And then on top of that, then you have the even smaller little pigments, which are just tiny little dots, okay? So we have these that are your polymer, and then you have these, which are your paint pigments, and they're all just sort of floating inside of this water base, okay? So if we were to look at that on the side, then we would see it like this. And a lot of people like struggle with this idea because they didn't realize that this is what happens. So those are the polymer pieces. This is the water. Now we have the pigments all put inside of here. And then as this dries on your canvas, it actually shrinks. And so you end up with a much shorter, so this is how you've applied it, and this is how it will dry. It shrinks as it dries. And so those pigments and the polymer and the adhesion and all that is like this when you're putting it on there, and then it kind of shrinks and binds together. And then that's when we have what we call a skin over the top of the canvas. Let me just grab this one we've been working with. So now this entire surface is covered with paint, which means there's a skin on the whole top because it's covered and everything is bound together. And that's what happens here. So if you were to apply a regular type of paint like this, this is a Dick Blick studio acrylic. This is a student grade. I use it a lot in my classes. It comes out somewhat thicker or thinner than like a heavy-bodied golden wood. And so it will automatically start to spread and level, okay? These paints will level out and become one smooth, consistent surface for you. If you were to use heavy-bodied paints, heavy body paints will end up having a little bit more texture in the surface based on how you've applied the paint with a knife or your brush. It'll leave a little bit of an inconsistency in the surface when you use the heavy bodies. They'll hold the texture a little bit better. So knowing that, I think the other thing for you to know is that when a paint is wet, it will tend to look a little lighter and brighter, especially when you have it on a white surface like a palette or something. You put that paint on there, it looks brighter. And then as you apply it to a canvas and it dries, it'll become darker. Acrylics usually dry darker. Now there are some new chemical formations out there, and Winsor Newton, I think, is leading that charge, where they're trying to create paints that do not alter in color as they dry as much as they did when acrylics came on the market. Which acrylics came on the market, like they started out in the 1950s, late 50s. They were played with a little bit mostly by the manufacturers in the 60s, and then by the 70s they were out there in the marketplace for everybody to use. There weren't a lot of choices in color and mediums and things like that. As time has gone on, we've got so many more companies. We have Golden Acrylics, we have Matisse, we have Liquitex, Utrecht. We have Winsor Newton. This is a gallery. Master. So even all the craft stores have their own label now. This is Master's Touch, which is from Michael's. Dick Blick is an online shop. And there's just so many, especially if you get into the craft type paints, right? So this is Craft Smart, but there's Folk Art and Americana and all these different brands. The thing to know is that you can use any of these paints in combination with one another. You don't have to buy a brand and then stick with that brand because somebody told you it's the best, or this is a professional brand, or you know, this will mix with this even. And you can even mix these with the latex wall paint, which is a polymer based paint also. But you have to think about the purpose. What is the purpose? Why am I using this paint in the first place? And that's how you make your decision. So these paints that come in these little craft bottles here have a lot more of the fillers in them, like the adhesive and the water, and less pigment. And that's why you can find these maybe a little cheaper than you can find these golden paints. So golden paints are kind of more on the other end of the spectrum, right? So golden paints are, these are created for professional artists, and they have they're much thicker. And in fact, maybe I'll just open this up if I can. I'll open that up and you can see how thick and pasty that paint is on the inside of this. And this is watery. This will just pour out of that bottle. And so in between then you have these other brands, like these store brands and the student grades of all brands. All brands have a student grade. So Winsor Newton is a very good paint company, and yet Galleria is their student line. And so Master Choice or Master's Touch is from Michaels, but Michaels doesn't make paint. They probably purchase it from some other company and put their name on it, but it's still a student grade. It's more along this line. The paint comes out, it's somewhat like, it'll look like toothpaste when it's coming out, but it'll kind of flatten out on your palette more like, a little bit more like melted butter. The thicker paints and the more like Liquitex and the golden, these kind of paints will come out even more like toothpaste and kind of hold the shape like toothpaste will. And that means basically it has less of the water in it, more of the pigment. The pigments are stronger. The paint, it has a different sheen to it because the more water you add to anything, the more matte the paint becomes. These will be very glossy unless you water them down. So here's the basics on that. If you're going to water your paint down, you want to make sure you don't add any more than about 25 to 30% water for thinning. Other ways of doing that is with mediums. We'll get into mediums on another day. So let's just take a look at that then. We'll bring this offloading board over. Another good thing offloading boards are good for. And I'll just show you some of these different consistencies in this paint. Okay, so this is a Liquitex, and it is a professional grade paint. It's sitting there, it's not flowing. This is a Dick Blick studio grade paint, and you can see already it's got some movement just from coming out of the container. And then let's put some of this little craft paint out there just so you can kind of see what happens with each of these as you put them out. This one, I think, might even be a little older because I got some of these around from years ago. So it's sitting there for now because it has probably dried a little bit in here. It's usually a little bit waterier than that. But now if I take a brush to it, let's just take a brush to this one, kind of spread it out here a little bit. And then I'm going to clean that brush off. And I'm going to come over here and spread this one out a little bit. I don't know if you can tell this so much on the camera or not, but this has got a little bit thicker consistency to it, even as I brush it out. And then I'll come over here to the white. And here's the beauty about white. This is titanium white. And titanium white is opaque white. So I could mix some of this pink into it. And now you can see that you see a little bit more of the underpainting through this pink color, but not so much through this, because titanium white is opaque. This pink has a little bit of transparency to it. So as I paint that out, even with some of the white still on my brush, you can see the colors from underneath shining through. And the blue is it's thick, and it's covering, even though this blue, if I were to spread that out a little bit, you can see how now the blue is also got a transparency to it. But because the paint is a thicker and heavier type paint, more professional grade, it's going to block out more than this cheap craft acrylic will. Now there's a use for all of these paints, so I'm not putting one down and telling you that one is better than the other. I'm not going to tell you that, because they all have their purpose. So with this craft paint, these paints are specifically designed for folk art painting techniques. And those techniques require that you have a really nice, sharp new brush, and this paint is the absolute right consistency to use straight out of the tube. So that's one of the benefits to that. So if I were to go ahead and make some of those strokes like I made earlier in this session on brushes for the leaves, this paint, I don't have to add water to it. It's exact right consistency for making those kind of strokes. It's beautiful for that. This paint then would be far too thick. It comes out very thick. And then it's not going to have the same ability, especially if you don't have a good brush. It's not going to have the same ability. You may have to put a little bit of water in it, in other words, to get it to do such fine strokes as this paint. This paint, however, is professional grade. So if I were to be painting something that I would want to sell or hang in a museum or gallery, I'm going to want to go to this kind of consistency and quality of paint. Because it is beautiful. It's just beautiful paint to work with. Very rich and creamy, and it's got a wonderful consistency to it. So I'm just playing a little bit while I'm showing you guys this. This is my offloading board, so I'm trying to offload a little bit right now so that I can go back into the white again. I'm not cleaning my brush off. I often don't clean my brush off. That helps all your colors kind of look like they go together a little bit more when you do that. But I want to show you this consistency. Now, out of student grade paint, I kind of like the Dick Blick student grade. It's very similar to the professional grade in its consistency, at least the white. I don't use a lot of the other colors, but I do use the white, especially in my classroom. And I like the consistency of it. I love that it has a nice opaque. It's blocking out everything from underneath of it, right? That paint's still a little wet, but you can see it's got a real nice way of blocking out whatever's underneath of there. And I'm just going to scatter it around just so that I like to make even my offloading boards look beautiful. So bear with me while I play for a second. But it's got that nice, rich, creamy consistency to it too. Now, if you don't add water to any of these, they're more likely to be the same glossy consistency. The more water you add to any of them, the more matte they will become. So you're going to want to have, if you're wanting your painting to have a matte finish, then I recommend that you buy a matte medium that you can add to your paint instead of water. It will make these colors even more transparent because you're spreading out the pigments, okay? So let's go back to our little board here. So you've got your layer here, and this is what it would look like normally with just the paint. And then when you add medium to it, then these get spread out even more. Not necessarily the the Palmer, because the little beads, the plastic beads, that's the same consistency inside the mediums, right? So a medium is simply a base. I can get this to work. It's a base without color. So when I add my paint to my medium, then I have reduced the amount of color, the pigment. I've reduced pigment. So instead of it looking like that, it'll start looking like this, which means that when it dries to this, the pigments are spread out enough so that then the light is going through this surface to the surface below it, whatever color, or if it's raw canvas, it'll pick up some of that because there's space between the particles of paint, which makes it, whatever color it is, more transparent. And so if you understand the science of that, then it makes it much easier than when you go to paint and you know what's going to happen. I'm going to go back in here and just play with this a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit of color around these edges. Just because it's on my brush, I didn't like plan this painting, and I'm just playing. So I'm offloading color. There's two things. I mean, I've had a lot of people say, oh, well, you're very frugal. Well, yes, I'm frugal, but you have to understand also, this is the other side of that. All of this is going to end up going down the drain. And this is plastic. And eventually that plastic is going to dry and become hard, just like it is on this canvas. So environmentally, what I'm going to want to do is use my offloading board to offload as much paint as I can before I put my brush in the water. So I'm putting less of the plastic into the water system. And I can also do one other thing. I can allow this to sit overnight. If this water sits overnight, the pigments and the plastics, they drop to the bottom of the bucket. And then I can very easily, if you just very easily tilt this and pour it out, the water will siphon off the top and leave you the residue in the bottom. And then you can take your paper towel, what's left of that, and wipe out the bottom of that, and then you're not putting it into the water system. So there's an environmental aspect to my wanting to teach you to do these offloading boards so that we don't waste the paint. Yeah, that's one thing, but so that we don't put the paint down in our water system. So that's one of the things I started teaching my students in my classes, because in the classroom, when a student doesn't know, they will automatically take their palette, whatever paint might be on it, and they'll just wash all that big globs of paint into the sink, and then the sink gets clogged. We have to have a plumber out and that kind of thing. So these are things that I want you to learn so that you preserve your pipes in your house and you utilize the paint that you have